This video was made possible by support to my Patreon and through YouTube memberships.
Who's been nitpicking everything? It's been the council all along.
Successfully pulling off a serialized mystery series might be one of the trickiest things in all of television. Even something as straightforward as a murder mystery can be difficult to sustain over the course of a season. But the truly bold take it a step further and present a series where the mystery is what on earth is even going on right now. Many have tried, from benchmark setters like Life on Mars or Fringe to forgotten shows like Early Edition or Wayward Pines, to shows that failed to secure second seasons like Flash Forward, Kings, and Alcatraz, to shows that didn't even get to finish their first season like Defying Gravity and The Messengers. Does anybody else remember The Messengers? Because I don't. My point is that what WandaVision set out to do, drop the viewer into a situation that didn't make immediate sense and expect them to stick around to find out what was going on, may be an easy hook on paper, but in practice, it's very difficult to pull off successfully. Even the more successful attempts at this kind of storytelling, such as Lost, which arguably kickstarted a massive wave of such shows, floundered as it went along. But then maybe part of the problem for Lost and Heroes, amongst others, was running for multiple seasons, because that's how it became clear just how much was being made up as it went along. So limiting it to one season and knowing how you plan to end should have given WandaVision the home court advantage and the ability to really nail this kind of television. So the question is, did it?
WandaVision, WandaVision, WandaVision.
Now, I have my own thoughts on this, and believe me, you will be hearing them. But I also wanted to get a sense of what other viewers thought and just kind of get a gauge of the temperature of the room when it came to WandaVision once the whole thing had wrapped up. I conducted 2 polls, one on that wretched hive of scum and villainy known as Twitter, and one on the community tab for this very YouTube channel. I gave voters 4 options, and while the specific percentages of what ended up getting how much, it varied. Overall, you can see the results are pretty consistent between the 2 polls, with the most votes going to it was good from start to finish, and the fewest going to it never really gelled. So that should settle it, right? Well, not so fast. Couple of hitches. Firstly, in both cases, the second most voted was that it started well and lost stream. And then, if you actually check the comments, a new pattern emerges, because it seems that a fair number of people who actually voted it was good from start to finish had an asterisk to add to that, usually regarding the last 1 or 2 episodes. Not strong enough reservations for them to say that the show lost steam and vote for that option, but enough that they didn't want a vote of praise to go unqualified. I kind of expected this, actually, and I wanted to have an option for it was great except for the last 1 or 2 episodes, but Twitter would only give me 4 options, and I wanted the poll to be identical in both places. So while this whole thing that I engaged in, it's hardly scientific, it does seem to indicate a general trend of opinions on the last few episodes being lower than the beginning and the middle. So how about we section this 9-episode series off into thirds, which conveniently the story actually breaks neatly into distinct segments of 3 episodes apiece anyway. And then we'll try and figure out what went right and what went wrong. So WandaVision begins by giving a look at the day-to-day lives of its titular couple. Lives that seem to resemble an old-fashioned sitcom rather exactingly, right down to the canned laughter and the boss coming over for dinner plotline. It's presented matter-of-factly not as a parody of 1950s-style sitcoms, but a faithful recreation of the character setting, vibe, and writing of those things. If it weren't for a scant few moments like Vision questioning what his job even is, or vague references to Marvel-specific settings like Sokovia, you might be forgiven for thinking that it's just a straight-up tribute to old sitcoms starring two Avengers for some reason. It's really only the end credits where that first episode shifts to somebody watching the whole thing on a TV and there gets a sinister overtone to the whole thing. The next two episodes move things up to the 60s and then the 70s in terms of the style of sitcom it's emulating, which establishes a pattern that the audience can expect going forward. And even despite that, it largely keeps up the facade established in the first episode. There's a few more reminders that this reality isn't quite right, even by TV sitcom standards, with bits like the radio in episode 2 and Herb trimming the wall in episode 3. This is a bold start. It shows a real commitment to the bit that I can certainly admire. If there's a criticism of these opening episodes, it's that your enjoyment is going to heavily depend on how much you like the style of sitcoms being emulated. That's an aspect that'll matter less going forward as the world outside of Westview makes itself known and the episodes don't keep consisting of the pastiches almost entirely. But in these first three, if you don't have any nostalgia for these old style sitcoms or just don't care for that kind of humor, there's going to be a little bit of a ceiling on how much you actually enjoy them. And that was honestly the case for me. But even knowing that I was kind of groaning my way through much of these first three episodes, I was still intrigued enough to power through. And the show really did pick the perfect bit at the end of the third episode to cue that we're about to start finding things out come episode 4. Now, episodes 4 through 6 comprise what was, for me at least, the strongest section of the show. Without dropping the initial concept of the sitcoms completely, the show brings in elements of the MCU that we're already familiar with, starting with the largely unexplored event of people suddenly reforming at the end of Endgame, and then getting viewers invested in Monica, who we've conveniently already been spending time with on the show up to this point. So it's not like, wait, I don't even know who this person is or how they connect with anything. We get an outside look at Westview, start to understand the Hex, and follow Monica's journey, bringing in the rest of the supporting cast like Sword Director Hayward, Jimmy Woo, and Darcy Lewis. Doctor. It's well-paced, doles out a pretty decent amount of information without overloading viewers with exposition, and still leaves enough questions hanging to not feel like the show has pulled the curtain back all the way. Episode 5 bounces between events in Westview and the perspective of the people outside. But just when you wonder, is this what the rest of the show will be? Is there really any more surprises to give? Then the bomb of Fietro strolls in. That was a hell of a WTF moment. Blew a lot of people's minds, and it was frankly a heck of a flex for Disney to pull. Not sure it was worth it in the end, but we'll come back to that. Episode 6 doesn't have the same kind of bombshells in it, but it shows that Vision is starting to question all of this, and it presents the divide between Hayward and the trio of Monica, Jimmy, and Darcy as he tries to boot them out of the whole operation. And then we hit the ending cluster of episodes. Episode 7 returns Monica to Westview, shows that Wanda's control of everything seems to be splintering. Fitting, given that we're now up to the 2000s and 2010 style of sitcoms with fourth wall breaks, and the ending of that episode reveals Agatha Harkness as the show's villain. Episode 8 gives us Agatha's backstory, as well as more insight as to what happened to Wanda, both in her childhood and immediately before the start of the show. And then episode 9 wraps it all up with the Hex being dissolved and Agatha defeated. All good, right? Well, okay, so let's talk about why this ending doesn't really work, or at least why it doesn't work as well as it should have done. I mentioned at the start that if people took issue with the show, it was fairly consistently with the latter parts, at least much more so than the opening. I mean, heck, I didn't even enjoy the opening that much, but I'll freely admit that was a taste issue, and not actually anything that the show did wrong. But I think there are some things that the show did wrong in that closing chunk of 3 episodes. First, let's talk about what is almost always the double-edged sword of these kinds of what's going on is the mystery shows. That of fan theorizing. The inherent advantage of this kind of show is that if you can hook that initial audience, and that if is the big gamble at the start of these projects. You are going to have one of the most engaged and committed fan bases any show could hope for. And WandaVision had the bonus starting advantage because thanks to the existing MCU fan base, there really was no question of if it would hook its initial audience. But that dedicated and engaged audience comes with drawbacks. Bustling forums and pop culture sites buzzing with possible theories about what's going on and what twists may be coming is all well and good while the show's running. But it has a nasty habit of kneecapping how much that same fan base is going to enjoy the actual answers. There is the petty element of people just being annoyed that their own theories were wrong or insisting that what they thought was going on would have been better than what happened. But it would be dismissive to assume that is the case for anybody let down with the ending. I think there's something that runs deeper than that, which is the simple fact that a mystery answered means there's nothing more to be done with that mystery. Jack the Ripper wasn't the world's first serial killer, nor the most prolific, and yet he's never going to leave popular imagination simply because we don't know for sure who he was. A mystery can keep you invested indefinitely, but getting answers gives you a stopping point, a reason to disengage because, well, now you know. As a personal example, I've only seen the first season of Lost, and I absolutely loved it, but I made a conscious choice to not watch any more of it. Because what I loved about it was that by the end of that first season, the answers behind the goings-on of the island could have been literally anything. Time travel, government projects, aliens, dimensional rifts, purgatory. Heck, it could have just been a wizard messing with people for laughs.
There are some who call me Tim.
It was all on the table, and I really didn't want to keep watching and see those possibilities slowly whittle away until the true answer was revealed. Now, I expect I'm a bit of an outlier in how far I took that commitment to the mystery on a show like Lost, but I think that same impulse exists in most audiences that are drawn to these shows, at least to some degree. So, in truth, WandaVision was always going to disappoint a chunk of its audience with its ending just by virtue of being a mystery-driven show with a wealth of possibilities and those possibilities gradually narrowing down to a single answer. And it's arguable that is just part of doing this kind of show. And it really isn't anybody's fault. But I do think there were two main elements where the show misstepped, and it was their fault. Fietro, or fake Fietro, or
Fietro, if you will,
and Agatha. And it's interesting to look at both because the former is a mistake on the meta-viewing level, and the issues with it wouldn't become clear until the last episode, and then the latter is a misstep within the confines of the episode itself. So let's start with Fietro. Within the world of the show, and indeed within the greater MCU as a whole, the idea behind this is completely sound. Somebody who claims to be Wanda's brother but is visibly somebody else altogether and may just be gaslighting Wanda.
That's not exactly how I remember it.
You probably suppressed a lot of the trauma.
Fits in with the mystery vibe and the what is going on tone of the show as a whole. Having him turn out to be just some guy named Ralph doesn't really matter because it was how his presence threw things off that was interesting. Who he really is matters much less than the fact that he's clearly not who he says he is, but somehow still has the abilities and at least some of the memories that Fietro would have. Totally sound, not a problem. But of course the character Fietro doesn't exist solely in the world of the MCU. He exists in the entertainment environment of a fandom that was guaranteed to lose its mind because, oh my god, that's the guy who played Quicksilver in a completely different set of films. But the story actually being told, there's no reason that Fietro needs to be anybody other than just somebody who isn't Pietro Classic. But in casting Evan Peters, the people behind the show knew exactly what they were doing. What they didn't appear to have realized, though, was the kind of expectations that doing this would suddenly place on the show. Earlier, I opted to not dwell too much on people let down because their own theories didn't pan out. And that was largely because most of those theories were never backed up by anything concrete anyway. They'd take one tiny detail that might have just been a random Easter egg or even just flatly nothing, combine it with a cross-section of information from the comics and spin elaborate theories about how at the end of the show we'd see Doctor Strange show up to help free Wanda from the clutches of Mephisto, who was behind the whole thing. These kinds of theories are actually kind of the reason I don't engage in or with theorizing much in the first place. But while those kinds of overly elaborate notions can really be laid at the feet of an engaged audience with an overactive imagination, alongside things like Jar Jar Sith Lord theory from Star Wars, any theories around the fact that Fietro was played by the guy from another universe of films, a universe that Disney now owns outright, those were directly spurred on by this casting. And it's frustrating to find out that the show ultimately thought it could just drop that in and then go, nah, it's nothing really, and get away with it. Especially when you factor in that it's been confirmed already that Wanda is going to be in a film called Multiverse of Madness. How could they think they'd be able to light the fireworks of, we're totally going multiverse up in here, and then deliberately pour water on the wick before it goes off and say, just kidding.
You're Ralph Boner?
You know, it's funny. In my review over in the break room of Geeks, even though I didn't really do much beyond suggesting a vague, maybe it's this, I don't know, I did make one core assumption. I seriously doubt they're going to make the mistake of having it actually not mean anything. I assumed the people behind the show would realize they could not do something that would set off this kind of mad speculation and then try and shrug it off. I mean, if nothing else, you'd think they'd have seen how divided the fandom was over Rey's parentage in the new Star Wars films and gone, yeah, we don't want that kind of reaction. But my point is, the only assumption that I made about the casting of Evan Peters was, well, it can't just be a meta joke that means nothing. And guess what? It was a meta joke that meant nothing. And before some of you come at me, yes, maybe in future projects it'll turn out to actually mean something, or they'll retcon it in some way, or maybe they were using it as a test bubble to gauge reaction to the idea of integrating some of the actors from things like Fox's X-Men without having to actually commit to it yet, or whatever. But even if any of that happens, it won't change the fact that here, within the confines of what was sold as a complete product, it has no meaning beyond a meta joke. And in the end, a pretty weak joke at that.
Boner.
But again, to be fair, if it wasn't for the meta aspect, there wouldn't be a problem with Fietro. Agatha, on the other hand, needs no meta baggage to not really work at all. First, let me say that Catherine Hahn, not the problem. She's clearly having a ton of fun in the role, she plays it with aplomb, and as tends to be the case when I harp on things this much, it's a writing issue. Now, exactly how many problems there are with Agatha is going to vary from viewer to viewer, basically depending on how much knowledge you came into the show with. So, if you've never heard of this character, you might have been taken out of the story by the end of episode 7, being the reveal of somebody who has no meaning to you and the show doesn't provide an explanation for until the next episode. If you do know Agatha Harkness, then you might take issue with the turning of an often morally complicated character into a straight-up cackling villain. Because we don't have an overabundance of evil witches in pop culture or anything, so let's turn a nuanced supporting character from the comics into one of those. If they wanted an evil witch, there are others available. The Marvel version of Morgan Le Fay leaps to mind. And I know Marvel isn't obligated to be 100% accurate with these characters. Heck, Wanda herself, having powers unlocked by an Infinity Stone, is already a notable departure from her origins in the comics, and the MCU saw fit to not bring up any of her Romani heritage. But I don't get why you do this much altering to a deep-cut character like Agatha, since the only people who'll know who she is are the same ones who'll know how much this character is unrepresentative of her namesake. But Anyways, no matter where you fall on the spectrum of who's that to, wait, they totally changed the character, Wanda versus Agatha is not a climax that fits this show. This is a show that starts out with a facade of vintage wholesomeness with a few cracks in it, through which viewers catch glimpses of something dark and creeping, and then proceeds to put that same wholesomeness into sharp contrast by showing its impact on the people trapped there and how it looks from the outside, before finally revealing this all exists as a manifestation of Wanda's desperately trying to stave off the grief of everything she has lost up to this point, which, as a recap, at this point includes her parents, her brother, and her supposedly impenetrable love interest, who, I'll remind you, she had to kill as a noble sacrifice and then be forced to watch that get reversed and see him die cruelly and pointlessly. Nothing about that story, tone, or theming points to a natural conclusion being wizard duel in the sky against somebody who isn't really behind any of it, but just popped in to grab a cup of magic for herself. That would be like ending Inside Out by having Sadness get in a climactic MMA brawl against Riley's imaginary boyfriend. What's particularly frustrating about all this is even if the show truly believed that it needed an action climax, which it doesn't, but let's just indulge the notion for a moment, she isn't even necessary in order to have that, because it already has White Vision, who actually does fit the thematics, since he's basically Vision without the emotional components, and Vision has been questioning his own existence since almost falling apart when he stepped outside the Hex. So having somebody who's going all, what even am I, then confront an incomplete version of himself is totally fitting. Hell, it's the same thing Logan did for its final fight. And the show even understood the character in question well enough to realize that it was better to resolve that with a philosophical conversation than a fist fight, but it was still a pretty neat fist fight. So that's getting to have it both ways right there. So Agatha isn't really needed for spectacle, even if you decide that you must have that. And she doesn't bring much emotional weight either, because she's got no history with anybody. The actual emotional climax of her confrontation with Wanda happens when the residents of Westview snap out of Wanda's spell and then beg her to set them free or allow them to die, confronting Wanda with the collateral damage she is causing by trying to stave off her own grief and focusing inwardly to the exclusion of looking at the impact of what she's doing. And while Agatha instigates that moment by lifting part of the spell, that could have been caused by literally anything and it would have played exactly the same. Wanda could have lost focus by trying to help with the Vision fight, or Sword could have cracked the Hex a little bit from the outside and the spell could lift just enough to get the exact same confrontation scene. So Agatha isn't needed for the emotional climax either. You would think that as a bad witch to Wanda's good witch, she'd at least work as a dark reflection, a sort of there but for the grace of God go I character who is emblematic of what Wanda will become if she doesn't stop diverting her pain and instead actually confronts it and processes it properly. That would have given Agatha at least some thematic relevance, but she doesn't even bring that to the table, because the glimpse of her origin story has nothing to do with loss or grief, and she appears to be motivated only by lust for power, which has no connection to where Wanda is in her life, or really anywhere where she has been up to this point. Yeah, post-credit scene, maybe she's headed down that path now, but you know what? Screw that. A story cannot make or break on a bonus scene. The only way in which Agatha connects to Wanda at all is that they both mess with people's minds. But whereas Wanda has rationalized reasons for doing it, Agatha seems to just get off on screwing with people. And on paper, maybe you could connect those, but again, the core motives behind their actions bear no resemblance to each other, so that means they just don't link up. What is so infuriating about Agatha isn't just that she doesn't fit into the story properly. It's that there's absolutely no need for any character to be in her assigned role in the first place. The show revealed itself to be about emotional trauma, trying to cope with that, accepting loss, showing how trying to shield yourself from loss doesn't work and potentially harms others around you. And if you remove Agatha completely, all of the tools needed to tell that story are still present. They had all the ingredients they needed to make a perfectly good cake, and for some reason they just decided to pour a bunch of turkey gravy on it. Agatha's presence and the action climax muddles the emotional through line of the show for those last 3 episodes. And that through line was really solid. One of the other things I found while checking Twitter reactions was how many people were moved by the episodes digging into Wanda's loss. And that line from Vision about grief, that seems to have flat out broken some folks in the best way.
But what is grief? If not love, persevering.
I guess for me, ultimately the disappointment of WandaVision was seeing it lose its nerve in the last few episodes. I mentioned how I didn't really love those first 3 episodes, but I did admire the commitment and the boldness. It set me up to hope that that boldness would carry through, and at first it did. But then at the end, for no other evident reason than because it's superheroes, it throws in a pointless villain for a climactic fight that the show didn't need and nobody was asking for. The show was so sure of itself at the start, but by the end it went back to what it assumed were the expectations of a superhero show and became something far less unique. Missing the fact that people were going to connect with it largely for the ways in which it wasn't a standard superhero story, that's just infuriating. Not all superhero stories need to end in a fight because superheroes aren't actually a genre. They're a character type, and they can be used to tell many different kinds of stories, from family drama to space opera to espionage. And yes, I recognize that most of those stories can and do end in action scenes. But if the core of your story isn't about defeating the villain, or what the villain represents, or using the villain confrontation to show the hero's growth, then maybe you just flat out don't need a villain. I'm looking forward to the day that Marvel realizes it's big enough and its foundation is strong enough to prop up not just action genres, but any genre, just any story. And for about 6 episodes, I thought WandaVision marked the start of that day. It didn't, and given what's on the horizon for Marvel, I don't know what else possibly could herald that day, and it may never come. But I hope that if Kevin Feige and his producing partners are pondering over the mixed reaction to the finale of WandaVision, they'll realize the mistake wasn't stepping outside the superhero genre, but it was forcing superhero tropes back in when they weren't necessary. That's WandaVision, largely me breaking down why it kind of falls apart at the end. Again, at least for me, and maybe it falls apart harder for me than for other people, but it doesn't look like I'm alone in that assessment, that it didn't end quite right. And I think the disjointedness of bringing in a villain for a magic fight really kind of is at the heart of that. I mean, the stuff with Fietro doesn't help, but Agatha, her presence at all and her use really is just a letdown for this show. What did you think about WandaVision? Either the show itself or what I've had to say about it. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I have a Patreon, which is how I make my living and what enables this entire operation to keep running. I now also have YouTube memberships if you wish to support me that way as well. Both have perks, and it is my birthday this month, so that'd be a very lovely present if you wanted to do something nice for me. But even if you aren't able to do that, the usual stuff, liking, sharing, subscribing, that all helps me out, helps the channel. But you don't have to do that either. Because at the end of the day, you are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.